Welcome. This is the Homegrown at Home concert series for 2021 from the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. My name is Steve Winnick, and I'll be here interviewing Martin Carthy, who is the artist for one of our concerts. So welcome, Martin. It's great to see you again after all these years.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So you are a renowned figure on the English folk scene, a guitar player and singer who has been plying your trade for many years, and you are a recipient of the MBE, which is an award that we like to say that when you get that in the folk arts in Britain, it's roughly equivalent to what we have here in the US as the National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. So so you're one of the foremost figures in traditional English folk music, and we are so delighted to have you in our series. So thank you for doing the concert, and thank you for doing this interview as well.
It really is my pleasure. Thank you.
So let's talk about the beginnings of your career. We've had, a few years ago, we had Billy Bragg here talking about his book about the skiffle scene and the early days of English folk. And you, of course, have memories of those days. So tell us about the early days of the English folk scene as you remember them.
Well, there wasn't an English folk scene when skiffle started. Skiffle was a big revelation to me. I can remember being in a music class, and there was one of my classmates, a lad called Rumsey, was talking about this particular record, called the Rock Island Line. I was, what the hell's that? Mm-hmm. He said, "Oh, it's fantastic. You need to buy it." So I went out the next day and I bought the 78 of the Rock Island Line by Lonnie Donegan, and I was completely overwhelmed, and I became a huge fan of his, because he often chose interesting songs, and I remember being with the people in my year weren't terribly interested. People in the year above were more interested, because they had the bloke who ran the best skiffle group in the school, and his name was Joe Lloyd. And I remember he was a kind of person who spoke. If you asked him a question, you get a one-word answer. Mm-hmm. He was very unforthcoming, and I went up to him and said, "Where do you get your songs from?" And he just said, "My dad." And I said, "Oh, really? What does your dad do?" "He's a singer." And who he was talking about was A.L. Lloyd.
All right.
His father. And so by complete fluke, I'm going to school with his son. And the people in the year below, there were other guitar hopefuls in the year below. And one of them was called Mick Bunn, and Mick Bunn taught me how to play in E. And from him, I learned Worried Man Blues.
All right.
So, I mean, basically, that was it. We were all scrabbling around we were all in the dark. We didn't know anything. And when we were told that what we were doing was rubbish, we would all sort of look at each other and go, "You just don't get it."
That's right.
You just don't get it. We're brilliant. We really understand. And I remember going to the house of one of the blokes, a guy called Mick Baker, who was in the year below me. Going to his house, and that was in Bermondsey, right by London Bridge. And his dad said, "Oh, Lonnie Donegan's rubbish." And I sort of bridled, as we all did, when said, No. He said, "No, a lot of that stuff that he sings is Irish." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, that Gambling Man that he sings, that's an Irish song. He's called The Beggar Man in Ireland. But none of you people know that." And that really struck home, and I realised that these songs had a history. There was more of a story behind them than the simple facts as related. And I just found myself drifting towards. I looked at folk songs for schools, the Cecil Sharp publication, and didn't find it terribly interesting. But that was all there was. But what happened to me a couple of years later was that there was a chap called Roy Guest, who was he was an odd figure. He very good at self-promotion, and he came up to me one day and he said, "Do you want to come to the Ballads and Blues with me?" And this was the very first folk club in the country. It had been put together at Alan Lomax's. It was Lomax's idea, and he wanted to get these two people together who he thought didn't know one another. And the two people he wanted to get together were Ewan MacColl and Bert Lloyd, A.L. Lloyd. And they came together and they started this club. And so this Roy Guest fella said to me, "Oh, I've managed to get myself on the bill. I rang Ewan MacColl and I told him that I was that I'd been collecting folk songs in Canada for the previous 5 years, and perhaps I could come along and sing a couple of songs." And of course, Ewan hearing this, he thought, "Oh boy, this is a great chance." He said, "Oh well, you must come this week, this Saturday, because that was the night of the club." And we have this wonderful old English singer called Sam Larner, and Roy affected to know what he was talking about, but had no idea who Sam Larner was, because when he came to me, he just said, "Oh, there's some old geezer from Yarmouth who's going to sing a few songs. He's about 80, so he's probably hopeless. He can't sing in tune probably." And so I said, "Well, no, I'll come along." And I went along with him, and he blotted his copybook immediately by singing his first song, which was John Henry, which was a fairly un-Canadian thing to do. And that was his. And Ewan never flinched. He let him have his 4 or 5 songs, and then he just introduced Sam Larner, and he never sang a song all night. What he did was I'm sure that he'd had Sam staying with him for a few days beforehand, and he plotted what Sam would do, and it was I was absolutely blown away, because I thought I knew some of the songs because of Folk Songs for Schools. "Oh no, John," and he sang a version of that, and he said, "Going to sing that?" And I thought, "Oh, I know that one," and he started singing it and got to a couple of risque verses and looked at Ewan and said, "Am I to go on?" And Ewan said, "Oh yes, you can go on." And the audience went, "Oh, oh, 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 oh." And he sang the entire song, and it was wonderful. And there were quite a few songs like that where I thought I knew the song, and I didn't, because it was wildly different.
So it had been Baudelarized a bit for the book.
For Folk Songs for Schools, it had been fairly seriously Baudelarized. But in order to get to the versions that Cecil Sharp had collected, you would have to get through the librarian, who was, as I discovered to my cost, they were so against these young scruffs coming and asking about I want the original version of this song, and their attitude was, and I've said this a million times, "We are the guardians of the English tradition, and we're guarding it from you." That was the attitude. And when the librarian changed, and it became a woman called Mrs. Ruth Noyes, and she would welcome us with open arms. But this is going on a couple of years. It was a hopeless notion but I'm digressing. The fact is that Ewan saved the best thing for last, and what he had Sam to sing for his last song was a thing called "Lofty Tall Ship," which is his version of Henry Martyn, as you probably know. And I'd never heard a tune like that in my life. He sang this song and just kept varying, and it had an opening verse which was different from anything else that he was then going to sing, and what he sang after that had variations galore. And I was thunderstruck, and I'm walking away thinking, "He can't sing a tune like that," and I'd la a bit of it to myself. Now, I never got the joke, and so I said, "No, you can't sing a song like that. No, you can't sing that." But what that did, that whole, because my friend who got me to come along had sung his first songs and then disappeared.
Right.
And I just stayed and was completely enthralled by this old man whose energy was astounding, and his passion was just, he just rocked you back on your seat every time. That absolutely wonderful performance, really was. And I decided then and there, oh, this is what I'm going. This is it. This is what I'm going to follow. And it took me a long time to be able to sing a lot of those songs, partly because I had to do a bit of owning up later on. I didn't want to sing them until I could play them, and I had to learn how to play. As we were going sailing, lofty tall ship, I had to learn how to play it. And it took me a long time to figure that one out. And when I did, I felt a great sense of triumph. And I'm a late developer as far as guitar playing is concerned. I had a reputation back in the 60s, but it was nobody was really any good. And if you were a bit better than not much good, then you were really, people looked up to you. And I could play a bit, but it was only when I started playing around with tunings that things began to make sense. And I did that because of a visit by an old-timey band, all from Harvard University, called the Charles River Valley Boys.
Sure.
And they consisted of Ethan Signer, Bob Siggins, and Clay Jackson, playing fiddle and mandolin was Ethan, banjo was Bob Siggins, and guitar in various different tunings from Clay Jackson. And I was just fascinated by what they were doing, and just what are you doing? What are you doing there? Oh, it's just like this, and they would show me what they were doing. And it was the beginning of something. And I wasn't the only one who was messing with tuning. There were lots and lots of us doing just that. But the one who actually invented the tuning that made a difference was Davy Graham, when he came up with Dadgad. And I was absolutely ecstatic about that. And I started doing it. And then I found it really frustrating, because I had to move the capo up and down. I could only play in D in Dadgad, and I'm sure I could have played in other keys as well. I'm sure I could have, if I'd have tried, but it wasn't satisfactory. And the great thing, I came up with a tuning that derived from Dadgad, which Davey started using, which I thought
that's nice.
Thank you, Davey. He said, no, thank you, Martin. We were always great mates, and until the day he died.
Yeah.
He was a good man.
So you had mentioned Sam Larner, and the fact that he was sort of 80 years old at that time, and you were a young lad who was attending 17. The folk club and enthralled. Yeah. And not to put too fine a point on it, but now you're in that position of being something of the elder statesman. And I guess the question I have is, are there any Sam Larner type figures anymore in the British tradition, or is everyone to some extent a revivalist now?
Well, the last major singer to be discovered in England was Walter Pardon. And Peter Bellamy always called him the man who collected himself. Yeah, because that's what he did. He knew a bloke who had taught Peter Bellamy in school. Well, he was related to this man whose name I cannot remember, who was who had taught Peter Bellamy at school. So this lad went to Walter and said, There's a cassette recorder. There's some cassettes. Why don't you record some of your songs, and I'll send them to someone who I think would love to hear them. So that's what Walter did, and he hadn't sung in public or to anybody for over 30 years. He discovered himself when he was 63. Yeah, well, it is. That's how Peter described him, and he was right. He presented himself to the world, and he was just extraordinary. Had this huge repertoire of trad songs from his Uncle Billy G, and he had songs that his father sang, and which was he kept as a separate repertoire, and songs that his mother sang, which he didn't sing very often because they always made him cry.
Right.
he was a wonderfully powerful character, but he was in many ways soft as anything. He was a lovely man. And he sang at we met him when we were all sent over for the bicentennial in '76, and we flew over together, and actually Walter and I sat next to each other on the plane, and he just chatted all the time. He was so happy to be singing again. And he told me the story of the first time he sang in public was at Norwich Folk Club. He said, and there were all people there, all listening, because his family used to tell him to shut up, so he stopped singing to them. But he said, I sang to this audience in the folk club, and they all listened and they all clapped. Oh, and then I sang it. He said, and then I sang at the Norwich Folk Festival, and there were hundreds of people there, and I stood up on the stage and I sang, and everybody was quiet as anything, and they listened and listened, and at the end of it, they all stood up and applauded, and I cried. Cried his eyes out, because he was so happy that he was actually singing to people who wanted to hear what he had to sing. Fabulous man.
So really, that's a lovely story, and it sort of shows how the folk scene took up being the audience for this last generation of singers whose own families had kind of given up on the folk tradition. Amazing.
Yeah, there are gypsy singers around who still sing. There's a lad called Thomas McCarthy, who's an Irish traveller, and he's extraordinary. So that there are still odd people. I can't think of a person with a repertoire the size of Walter Parham.
Yeah.
Maybe they're out there. There are still people singing songs, and they're still being recorded. And a lot of them are gypsies, and they have a different attitude towards melody. And
right.
It's just it's gorgeous.
It's striking.
It's not easy. It's weird sometimes, but just trust them. They're not messing about. They're singing the tune as they know it. Get your head around it. Yeah. Wonderful.
Well, to talk a bit, more about your early career. Again, you had a big birthday recently, and within a few days of your birthday, another person who was a friend of yours back in those days had a birthday too, and that was Bob Dylan. So you both turned 80 within a few days of one another.
Absolutely.
And
he's 3 days younger than me. He's a baby.
Yeah. So explain your association with Bob Dylan from those early days.
Well, the folk record shop. Well, there were a couple, but the major folk record shop in London was Collett's Record Shop on New Oxford Street, and the man who ran that was a lad called Hans Fried. And I would go when I still in. No, I was still in London at that time. If you wanted it to meet up with other folkies from out of town or whatever, local folkies to you, you would go down to Collett's Record Shop, and I went down to Collett's Record Shop, and there, on the counter was this copy of Sing Out, which was red, and on the front of it was the picture of this bloke, and they were all raving about this Bob Dylan, who is absolutely he's taking up the cudgels on behalf of Woody Guthrie, who an important figure. So I read the article, and there were a couple of interesting songs there, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I was in a group. We called them groups then, not bands. I was in a group called the Thamesideers. Had been the Thameside Four, and then somebody left, so we became the Thameside Ers.
That way you wouldn't have to change every time you added or lost a member.
We could add or subtract up to a point. And we ran a club at this a pub called the King and Queen, which was just behind Goodge Street tube station, next to the Middlesex Hospital. And the King and Queen itself is still there. It's on Foley Street, Foley.
Mm-hmm.
And we were singing there, doing our Friday night gig there, and we were playing away, and I happened to look up and straight into the face of the cover of Sing Out. Oh, we sang a couple more songs, and I just went over to him, said, "Excuse me," to Marion Gray, who was she was the other singer. The third member was the bass player, Pete Maynard. He didn't sing. I said, "Just going to go. I'll be back in a sec." And I went over to him and I said, "You're Bob Dylan, aren't you?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Oh, you were on the front of Sing Out." And he said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Would you like to sing?" He said, "Ask me later." So I, okay. And there may very well have been an interview. There may very well have been an interval shortly after that. And and at one point I just looked at him like that, and he went and smiled. So I introduced him, and he got up and sang 3 songs, and he blew people away. He was absolutely wonderful. And he came down to the Troubadour the next night, which was the other place where I would sing. I was a resident at the Troubadour in Earl's Court. It was a late night place, started about 10:30, and he came along to that, and it became a thing. He would come to the King and Queen, and then he would come to the to the Troubadour. He went to other places as well, but I didn't frequent those other places.
Right.
He basically got himself around because he'd been invited over by the BBC to do a play, which was at the time I just didn't get it. It was a thing called Madhouse on Castle Street, and it was basically the story was of some of immigrants in London in fact, they would all be people from the West Indies, but they were everybody in the cast was white, but it was basically the man who wrote it was a Jamaican, and Castle Street was represented England because it's a place full of castles. And it was a very, very odd play indeed. And the director, whose name has now escaped me completely, damn it, I'll remember in a minute, was a very good director. I can see his face now. I can't remember. Oh, memory, come back. It was the BBC had the temerity to wipe that particular play. It was a pretty important statement to have made at the time.
Yeah, the BBC wiped a lot of old films and tapes, unfortunately.
Yeah, they did. Certainly did that. I wish they hadn't done that one, because it was really, it really was groundbreaking stuff, and I simply did not get it at the time.
So was Dylan in the play, or was he doing the music?
He'd been brought over by the director, who'd seen him do a show. Maybe he was at the town hall concert, which actually sort of raised Bob Dylan to another level on the New York folk scene. And he was a kid, 20, 21 years old. It was he decided that he had to have him in the play, and he brought him over and he handed in the script. And on the first rehearsal, Bob Dylan said, I can't do this. I can't do. I'm not an actor. Why am I here? And so he didn't argue. Come along, remember the man's name. You've insulted him enough. I'm so cross that I can't remember his name. Anyway, he went and hired David. can't remember his name. He just had a massive hit at the Royal Shakespeare Company doing Hamlet, and he was the future of British acting, stage acting, and eventually film acting, because he spent a lot of time over here and has done all sorts of things here. And he's very, very good indeed, very powerful, very, very powerful actor.
David, not Derek Jacobi.
No, not Derek Jacobi. No.
Okay.
No. This is a very tall leading man sort of actor, 6 foot something. David.
Well, anyway, yeah.
I'm cross. But there's the trouble with being 80 is you lose all this. Anyway, so Bob had to stay there, and he sang "Blowing in the Wind" in the play, and he sang a song called "The Ballad of the Gliding Swan," which he's had some very rude verses for later on, which he'd sing to us. He never sang them in the play. I fancied that he'd sung them in the play, but he didn't. But he was Bob was he was really very naughty when he sang songs, because he would suddenly chuck in an improvisation. He was talking about at the Troubadour, talking about making his first album, and for him it was a playground, and he was doing all sorts of things which he would never do normally. And apparently the engineer said to him one time, You're supposed to be a folk singer. Sing a folk song. So he said. So Bob said, "Well, what's a folk song?" And he said, "Oh, something like Pretty Peggy-O." So he sang a Pretty Peggy-O and sort of ran out of verses and started improvising. And he sang his version of and he got the lieutenant. He's gone. He's long gone. He's riding down in Texas with the rodeo. Because Pretty Peggy-O, everything had to rhyme. So
right.
Texas with the rodeo, and when he sang it at the Troubadour, he suddenly threw in another improvisation that made him laugh, which was the general. He's gone. He's long gone. He's fighting with a wild man out in Borneo. But that's the sort of thing, the sort of mischief he would get up to. It's brilliant, absolutely wonderful.
It is brilliant, yeah.
Tremendous stuff, and he sang some fabulous stuff. I mean, this is the beginning of 1963 by the time he because he came over in mid to late December 1962, call it mid-December 1962 for the rehearsals for the play, and he would always end up at the Troubadour or the King and Queen or other clubs that were around at the time. He went to the Singers Club and had a mixed reception there. But I can never forget the time he sang at the Troubadour, and he sang "Hard Rains Are Going to Fall." That's and earlier on he'd sung what's that song? Oh, Tune of Pretty Polly. Hollis Brown.
Hollis Brown. Yeah.
Oh, what a song.
Yeah.
But he sang this particular evening at the Troubadour. He sang "Hard Rains Are Going to Fall," and you thought, well, he started to sing it, and I thought, oh, is he going to do Lord Randall? And it very quickly became clear that this wasn't Lord Randall at all.
Yeah.
But it was a fabulous piece of work. I don't know whether he just finished it, or he'd written it while he was here, or whether it was whether he had it in his repertoire when he arrived in England. But it was very new, and there was that little pause when he finished the song, and the place just exploded in applause. He sang some fabulous stuff, and he would just experiment on his audience. Wonderful.
Yeah. And now he has the Nobel Prize. So
and now he has the Nobel Prize. He changed. He did change everything. He changed everything.
Yeah.
He changed the Beatles.
Yeah, sure. So another fellow an American fellow that you hung out with at that time, and then later sang with again, was Paul Simon, who the library has given our Gershwin Award for Popular Song. So we're fans of Paul Simon, but we know that you were old friends with him. So explain your association with him as well.
Well, the thing I remember about Paul is he was he hardly ever spoke. He would come and sit next to him, hi, and that was all you'd get out of him. But he loved Scarborough Fair, and he learned Scarborough Fair, which became a court case. Which
Right.
What am I doing? It was the I had a publisher who was he was a publisher, and they just thought that this is an opportunity. And one of the things I did was sign over there was a court case, and at the end of the court case, one of the things I did when I went to see the publisher, said, "Oh, there's all these bits of paper, things you need to sign in the aftermath of the court case." And I said, "Yeah, all right." And I signed various things. And he said, "Oh, that one says you have no further claim on Scarborough Fair." And I said, "Oh, well, that's fine by me." And what I was doing was actually saying that Scarborough Fair was mine, and I was handing over the ownership of it to them, not to
Right.
but to them, to the company. Ever been had? Hello.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't own the bloody thing, but I signed it over. What an idiot,
So, but the
lovely thing was,
yeah,
the great thing was that many years later, Paul was doing a European tour, and I got a phone call from him, and I think he was in Stockholm, and he said, "I'm coming to London, and I'm doing 3 days at the Hammersmith Apollo, and which is it's a big gig, and it's a lovely hall. It was a cinema, but it's got a great stage." And he said, I want you to come and sing on one of the nights. Can you make it?" And I looked in the diary, and I could do the third night. And I said, "Well, I'm free on that day, and I'm close by." And he said, "Good, put it in your book. Come and sing. Come and sing. Come and sing. Come and say hello on stage." And that's what I did. And we sang Scarborough Fair together. He said, "You want to do that?" And I said, "Yeah. Oh yeah. I think it's important to do that." And so we did Scarborough Fair, and he was really, really so attentive. He said, "Which guitar shall I use?" And I said, "You use any one you want. You choose. I'm at your disposal." And he said, "Okay, this one okay?" I said, "Yeah, that's what you like, that one, play that one." And that's what he did. And the thing I remember most about that was that, having known him for 3 years, more or less, in the 60s, and I can never remember him saying anything more than half a dozen words. Now, there was one time where he tried to teach me and my mate to do some doo-wop outside where I had been living, and he took over my. I had a little flat there, little apartment, and he took it over. And when that fell flat, when we couldn't do it for the giggles, he said, "Oh, well, can you help me put this top on? It's a Sunbeam Alpine car. He bought this car." And we struggled to get the top, but we finally managed to do it. We got the top on the car, and that was it. Shortly afterwards, I think Art Garfunkel was in town. Shortly after that, and they came round to. Yeah, I'd moved. I was in a different apartment just up the road, and he and Art Garfunkel came round, and Art Garfunkel didn't say a word, but his head was in the air, and he was trying to work. I think he was probably working out the canticle, and I had a lovely chat with Paul. But again, it was single words. He's probably said more than he'd ever spoken in 3 years, introducing Art Garfunkel to me, and
Right.
and he was and Art Garfunkel was equally silent.
Well, great singers. So.
Oh God, yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
and Paul wrote all those songs, all those songs for Art to sing.
Yeah.
He could write to suit somebody, and he knew Art Garfunkel's voice, and he wrote for it. Gave him fabulous stuff to sing.
Right. So just to be clear, in case it didn't come through for the audience, one of the points there was that Paul Simon actually learned Scarborough Fair from you. And that was what the court case ultimately was about.
But and what he did, he didn't steal my arrangement at all. He sort of honoured it by doing something like it, which
right.
And it's a traditional song; it doesn't belong to me at all.
Right.
But I was, I got very, I was really quite upset by the whole nonsense, because that's what it was.
Yeah.
But the thing that I remember most was that after we sang together on the stage at the Hammersmith Apollo, we went. We sat down together, and he talked non-stop for an hour.
The most you've ever heard him speak, right?
Absolutely, and he was absolutely fascinating. And he was talking about all he said this tour has been about reconnecting with people I may well have fallen out with. And I'm really trying hard to. He said, "Were you mad at me?" And I said, "Yeah, briefly." But then I just thought, it became, the interviews just became what I was about to describe then as the trudge through the grudge, because it was nonsense. It was just stupid nonsense. And I said that to him. I said, "It's just silly. It's a traditional song. It's yours as much as it's mine.
Yeah.
For God's sake." And he, especially because of the canticle,
right,
made a lot of money, but not for him. The only person who made money out of that song would be Art Garfunkel, because he wrote the canticle.
Gotcha. That's interesting.
And he said, one of the things he said to me was, at the time, I mean, later on, that was sorted out. But one of the things he said, one person I would really, really, really love to connect with again, and I don't seem to be able to do it. I want to connect with Artie again. He was really upset that he couldn't, that it wouldn't happen. Well, it did happen later on.
Eventually, yeah.
And I'm sure they fell out again and then made up again, because, when you've been living in each other's pockets for all that time, you're gonna have rows and stupid rows, and then make up. Love you, man.
Right.
It's gonna happen. I had that with Swarb, so
yeah.
I know.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Swarb a bit, because that was, to sort of chronologically, that would be one of the next stages in your career, was being a duo with Dave Swarbrick.
Yeah, and I was never forgiven by certain parts of the Ian Campbell group, who said I basically kidnapped him. I didn't. It just he got fed up with being, well, because he was bullied, and he plays the clown. He used to play the clown a lot, Sorb, and it's sometimes. When your enemy is, if you can make your enemy laugh, then that's all right. But they just, everybody in the Campbells wasn't on his case, but there was one person who was. I won't mention any names. And it became hard work, and he was fed up with it. And he said, he rang me up and he said, "I'm going to go to Denmark. I'm going to go to Denmark to live. And I'm never coming back. So can I come and stay at yours? Because I get the train from Liverpool Street Station to the ferry to Harwich, and that takes me on the ferry to I can't remember the name of the town, the port, Esbjerg.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I remembered something. Yippee. Yeah. So. We took him. We chatted for ages that night. Went to bed, got up in the morning because he had, got to come to Liverpool Street Station with me. And went to Liverpool Street. I and my wife Dorothy went to the station with him, and we waved him off and said, "Oh, what a shame! Best musician in the country, and he's going to bloom in Denmark. He'll have a lovely time." I mean, there was a woman involved, of course, but he was madly in love. But that was, that's it. Bye, Dave. Bye, Dave. And we went home feeling, a bit glum. And 2 days later, was it next day? Well, I suppose it was an overnight. It was an overnight journey to Esbjerg. Oh no, he didn't. No, he wasn't. He didn't go to. He went to Rotterdam. That's what he did. He went to Rotterdam, and the Dutch the Dutch customs said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm leaving England and I'm going to Denmark, and I'm going to live there for the rest of my life, and I've got this lovely girlfriend there, and we're going to make babies, and we're going to have a wonderful time." And they said, "Oh, do you have a work permit?" And he said, "I don't need a work permit." He said, "Oh, I'm afraid you do. Yes, you have to have a work permit. Is there any chance you will get a work permit?" He said, "Well, I'll get easy as anything." He says, "No, you haven't got one, have you?" No, you can't go any further. We have to send you back." So they sent him on the next boat back to Harwich. Am I allowed to swear? I will swear once, and you can bleep it later on.
Right.
And the phone rang the next day or the day after, whenever it was. It was probably the day after we'd said goodbye to him. and I picked up the phone and I said, what I can't remember what our number was. Swiss Cottage, I can't remember what the number was. 0183, yeah, that was it. So, Hampstead 0183. And he said, and this voice came down the phone, "I could fucking weep." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, bloody Dutch people, they sent me back." I said, "What for?" He said, "I haven't got a work permit." I said, "What's he got to do with them? You're going to Denmark." He said, "Yeah, but they just stopped me. They just stopped me. They're not allowed to send someone through to another destination when they haven't got a work permit for that other destination. They're not allowed to do that, so they've sent me back." I said, "Oh, bloody hell. Well, you better come here, hadn't you?" He said, "Yeah." Yeah, grumble. Said said the same words as I just repeated for you a few more times, and he came over to where we were, Dorothy and I. And he sat down feeling really glum. And I said, "Well, I'm going away on an 8-day tour tomorrow. It's 8 gigs in 8 days. Do you want to come? And we'll just split what I make down the middle, and we'll just ask people if they'll pay your train fares." And he said, "Yeah, all right." I'd done my first album just the year before, and he'd been fined because he hadn't asked permission of the directly of the record company. So they fined him a third of his wages, which was £15 a week. So he fined him a fiver of his wages, and he wasn't very happy about that, as you can imagine. So he said, "Yeah, all right, I'll come with you, and next time I go over, I'll go over on the direct boat." So we went on this tour, and it was everywhere we went. I just went there and said, we knew, I think, either 3 or 4 songs which had been on my first album: The Two Magicians, Sauve, Broomfield Hill, Lovely Joan. There was another one, I can't remember what it was. I said Two Magicians, didn't I? Yeah. I can't remember what the other one was, but anyway, there were 4 or 5 songs that we could do, and straight away, and other ones. Dave was the ace improviser.
Yeah, that's right.
He knew the repertoire inside out. One of the things I sang was, well, it's not the Boston Burglar. It's what's it called? I can't remember what it's called. It's one of those. Damn it! It was from Harry Cox anyway. It was an Irish, a song very well known in Ireland, but it was Harry Cox's version. Harry Cox was another one of the very great English traditional singers, and he was in his 80s by that time. If he was still alive, I think he was still alive.
Yeah.
But he was a fabulous singer, with a fabulous repertoire. He was a very beautiful singer. I mean, Sam Larner was rough and ready. Harry Cox was wonderfully musical. You know, beautiful lyrical voice he had, even in his 80s. Oh boy. Oh. Yes. Why have I gone off? I keep going off track.
Well, we're talking about your duo with Dave on your first tour.
Okay. Yeah. So went and did the first gig was in Sheffield, and the last gig was in Sheffield. And by the time we finished the tour, he knew half of my repertoire, and he would always play a couple of slow airs. He might play he'd play a couple of slow airs. Play a slow air. Well, are you sure? Yeah, play a slow air. You like playing slow airs, don't you? Yeah, I do. I love them. And he'd play a slow air, and it really showed what he could do, and people absolutely loved it. He didn't get much of a chance to do it, except on special occasions. But he really was a mighty player even then. He took the most fabulous risks, and Bert Lloyd used to use him all the time because he could follow. Bert loved to go all over the place in his songs, and if he had Dave accompanying him, Dave was always there like that. You know, he had his teeth clamped to his shirt tails and went everywhere with him. Never missed a beat. Never missed. You know, he was quite remarkable, and he stayed that way. He could do. You could just toss a song at him, and by the end of the song, he had it, and say, "You're going to do that again tomorrow?" Yes, okay, I'll remember, and he would. Oh, wonderful. And some people liked it, and other people didn't. But the thing that is remarkable is that everybody contributed Dave's fares. Some of the places doubled our money.
Oh, that's very nice.
Oh, it's fabulous.
Yeah.
And by the end of the week, I was walking around with all this money in my pocket, and we'd done the last gig, and I said, "Well, I've got all this money. We should share it out." And he said, "Oh, don't worry about me." And I said, "No, come on, we've got a lot of money here, for goodness sake." And I pulled it out, and I just shared it all equally. You know, one for you, one for me. And he just went very, very quiet, and he just picked up this money, and I looked at him, and he was staring at the money. And I said, "You all right?" He said, "I've never had this much money in my life." I said, "Well, that's half of what we made." And it was either 70 or 75 quid, which then was a lot of money.
Sure.
I was being paid, I think I was being paid 12 quid a night. And I was going to have to get around the best I could.
Yeah.
So I was going to be making 8 gigs. I was going to be making 80 quid or something, 80, maybe up to 90.
Yeah.
For the week, and it was 8 gigs on the trot, and that was hard. And he just said, "No." I said, "Well, have you counted?" He said, "Yeah, I counted it all right. There's 75 quid there." Well, it's either 70 or 75. I'll say 75. No, and he looked at me and he said, "I'm making 15 quid a week with the Campbells.
Wow.
I'm on top money."
Right.
And because they paid him more than anybody else, because he asked for it, actually.
Yeah.
And he was going back. He then went back to Denmark with this money, and I said, "Well, you coming back? I've got another tour going at the beginning of next month, beginning of April in the northeast, starting off in Darlington." He said, "I don't know if I'm coming back. Don't know if I'm coming. I'm going over as a visitor." You know, he's going to lie his way through it. And because he was going to stay and get married. And then he came back. So we went on the road together, and we stayed together for 3.5 years, 4.5 years. That was 60. Oh, blimey. 66, 66, 67, 68, 69, up until the middle of August. So that's 3.5 years, really, because this was March.
And you toured pretty much throughout the country, right?
Oh, yeah.
Dave,
All through England and Wales and Scotland. We don't think we ever got to Ireland.
Interesting.
We went to Ireland later on, and he was always very nervous about playing Ireland, because he loved to play Carolan tunes, but he was very sure that people wouldn't like what he did with them, because he has a way with a tune.
His style, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
not exactly the Irish style. So yes,
no,
yeah. So soon after that, you did something musically that's very different from what you'd done before, and that was, of course, Steeleye Span.
Yeah.
Talk about how that happened.
Well, by that time I was living out in I'd come back from Denmark with enough money to put a deposit on a house, because we were very, very well paid. And we were there from middle of March through until New Year, the following year. And so I was living in Warminster, which is in Wiltshire. It's very, very lovely part of the world. It's on Salisbury Plain, basically. It's very nice. And this little sort of cottage place that was not brilliantly appointed, but it was home, and it was lovely. We were really, really pleased to have it. And people would come visiting on their way through, and regular visitors were Tim Hart and Maddie Pryor. They turned up one day and sat there, and I can't remember who said it first, Tim or Maddie. Could be Maddie. No, I think it was. Well, it doesn't really matter. He said, "We're going electric," and I said, "Really? Wow." He said, we're really struggling. We're trying to find a name. And I'd just been reading some of the songbooks that had been printed by the Lincolnshire Society, and they contained the songs which Percy Grainger had recorded in the first years of the 1900s, first years of the 20th century, recorded on wax cylinder.
On cylinders, yeah.
And I had a tape. There was a copy of 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 a tape of some of those cylinders. And I was absolutely blown away by it. I was listening to Joseph Taylor. He was a revelation, this wonderful, wonderful singer. And it was just very exciting to have. And one of the songs, as I say, I had some of the books that the Lincolnshire Society had published, and one of them contained a song called Hawkstow Grange, and the actual story of who's the goodie and who was the baddie had been reversed in the song. And the hero of the song was this character called John Span, whose nickname was Steeleye, and Tim said, "Oh God, that's a fabulous Steeleye Span. What a fabulous name! What, was that really his name?" And I said, "Well, obviously it was a nickname." He must have been a nasty bloke, or maybe he was a nice bloke. It just was very mean. But Steeleye Span, that was his. I don't know. And had this really unfortunate chorus: "Pity them who see him suffer, pity poor old Steeleye Span."
Right.
And I sang that bit to him. He said, "Oh, never mind that. Never mind. Steeleye Span. God, we're going to be voting next week." And next week they had a vote on it. And everybody had different names for it. And he rang me up and he said, "Thanks very much. The band is called Steeleye Span." I said, "Oh, great." He said, "Yeah, I voted twice." He always maintained that he voted twice and nobody noticed, you know. Yeah, come on. But that's what it was very funny. And they became Steeleye Span. The other one, the other names, there was they liked the idea that village bands were called waits in that in those back in the 19th century, WAITS, waits, and there were two versions of waits. One of them came from Ashley Hutchings, and the other one came from Terry and Gay Woods. And they were coming to Wiltshire to do their recording. They found people at that time used to go and rock bands would find a country cottage and go and get it together in the country cottage. That was the big deal. And they found this country cottage not very far from where Dorothy and I lived, in Warminster. And I, of course, can't remember the name of the place. No. God damn it. Anyway, never mind. They'd found this place. And the next thing I heard was that they'd made the album. And I heard the album, and it was okay. There was some nice stuff on it. But some of it was sort of strangely bare. And I said, oh, then maybe they're doing a bit of variation, just not having the whole band in this. Mutter. And then Tim rang up and said, do you want to join Steeleye Span? And I said, wait, what? And he said, do you want to join Steeleye Span? And I said, yeah, what happened? So Terry and Gay left. Well, Terry and Gay left, hadn't realised that they'd left. So I found out later on.
Uh-oh.
I mean, they were very nice about it, but they they took it on the chin, as they say.
Right.
And Ashley had, because Terry and Gay had gone back to Ireland, Ashley had decided that it was all over, and he'd gone and chummed up with Bob Pegg, Bob and Carol Pegg. In Stevenage, they lived in Stevenage, Newtown, and he was sort of presenting himself as the bass player for Mr. Fox, which was their band, and it was good stuff. They had a drummer, which Ashley liked, but Bob was really quite stern about the way the drummer should play. Because he didn't like the idea of that hefty backbeat. It sort of forces the music into a corner.
Right.
So he had this bloke playing with beaters a lot, and some of the stuff was bloody good, I must say. Excuse me, language. But he then came hot foot and rejoined Steeleye.
Right.
So we were working as a 4-piece to begin with, and rehearsing in the vicarage. Rehearsing in the church hall, which was next to the church where Tim's dad was the vicar. So we had this big hall, and we were just cranking up, and they had all this fabulous equipment, dual Showman ads, these great big 4.5 foot, 5 foot high speakers, and you could play really loud.
Yeah. So you were playing loud rock music.
Well, I just played a loud guitar. I didn't know about rock music. I just played a loud guitar. And I really, I mean, the first thing I did when I said, this is an electric band, I better go and get a guitar. And I talked to Ashley briefly, and he recommended I get a Telecaster, because he had a thing about Telecasters, basically because of Robbie Robertson. He's a huge Robbie Robertson fan, and he was a Telecaster player. And he said it's a very different sound. It's not a smooth sound like a Telecaster, like a Stratocaster. It's a very, very down to earth. And he said, look, I like it. So I went and bought this bright blue Telecaster for 110 quid. And just plugged into this giant amp. and had a wonderful time. Thank you very much. And had a few things to a few things to offer.
Hmm.
And it was very exciting. And singing harmony with Maddie was a revelation. She can be a fabulous harmony singer. One of the things we did, which I still listen to with great pleasure, is "Cold Haily Windy Night,"
Yeah.
and I listened to that harmony that she dreamed up. Oh, what a clever woman! My God. Whew. Yep.
Yep. And you
And I
made
had a
some
great time.
great music with them.